Hello, everyone, and you're all very welcome to today's Client Experience Programme webinar. Our topic for today is being an effective change leader. Kurt Lewin, the renowned social psychologist, famously said, "If you want to truly understand something, try to change it." So it's with this wisdom in mind, and as always with our Client Experience webinar programme, we're very much looking forward to bringing you practical insights on this critical leadership area of leading and managing change. These sessions are all about you. We're really keen for you to get the most value from them in terms of practical takeaways. So I encourage you to make the most of the chat and the messaging functions as we work through today's discussion. Our panel have an action-packed 60 minutes ahead for you all. So without further ado, I'm excited to hand you over to my colleague, Joanne Wakeford, who will introduce you to the team and lead you through today's discussion. We hope it delivers value for you.
Thank you very much, Niamh. Welcome, everyone, from wherever in the world you may be joining us today. Looking forward to our discussion. My name is Joanne Wakeford. I've had the pleasure of presenting on a few CX webinar programs in the past. I'm very excited to be here again with you today. I have the pleasure of acting as a coach and thought partner to our clients around the world on business of law topics, including change management programs. And this has become such a crucial element of any operational change program. I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleagues who bring some incredibly rich experience to today's discussion. That's a tough one. Atul, let me start with you, please, as Executive Chairman of Dentons Link Legal. Will you please introduce yourself?
Thanks, Joanne. I'm delighted to be a part of this webinar. I am the Executive Chairman of Dentons Link Legal, or rather new entrant into a combination with Dentons Global. I am the global board member of Dentons. I came to bar as far back as 1978, and I am registered as an attorney with the Delhi Bar Council, the Supreme Court of India, and of course various tribunals and the High Court, particularly in Delhi. My home court is Delhi, the Delhi High Court. I had this experience is in 2023 when suddenly I found myself swimming in the purple sea of Dentons. And so this change was so significant and overnight, which I'll deal with later. But what was critical about this was that we overnight became a firm from 250 lawyers across 5-6 offices in India to a firm which was global with 200 plus offices in 80 countries then, which is now plus 90 plus. And the change had to be heralded in a manner which is very seamless. And I can say with some pride that we succeeded in doing that. Thanks.
Thank you, Atul. Andy, also excited that you're joining us today. Andy Stiliano, who's head of consulting at Dentons Helix.
Thanks, Joanne. Hi, everyone. So I've been working in the legal sector for about 6 years now, but before this, I was a management consultant delivering change programs in the finance and transport sectors, among others. I now specialize in transforming in-house legal departments to be able to get the benefit of legal outsourcing, which we achieve through a combination of lawyers, technology, process optimization, and all of this requires a large amount of change management. With the main outputs being sort of cost reduction, more controlled processes, visibility, and more importantly, freeing up legal departments to become stronger business partners. So that's sort of what keeps up my time at the moment.
Excellent, thank you. So we're excited for the conversation today. Welcome comments in the chat. We're gonna have a few poll questions. Of course, we always do poll questions. We're going to talk a little bit today about what makes an effective change leader. We'll discuss some of the key success factors that we've seen that are essential for any change program, and we're going to have some fun and do some scenario discussions to see how these principles apply in real life. So I think we can all acknowledge that change can be difficult, and sometimes it can feel uncomfortable, and sometimes we have more ability to control how the change happens, and sometimes it just happens to us. But change is a necessity, and it's how we evolve, it's how we improve, and ultimately, and we'll talk about this, how we learn from our mistakes. But change is happening, it's constant. And in our last webinar last year, we conducted a poll question, and we know that 57% of attendees are expecting transformational level change. But change doesn't always have to be that big type of meaty change. And yet some of the more simple programs cannot go as smoothly as desired because of the way we approach it. It can be as simple as changing the way we work, maybe moving from a work from home situation to a hybrid or a full office shift. It could be organizational change, who you report to, who reports into you, maybe your title, maybe there's a new general counsel or a new CEO. In fact, in last year's program, again, we asked the poll question, and our attendees cited that new roles and responsibilities was one of the biggest challenges they're facing. This was followed only by process transformation. So, of course, there's other change that happens that might not be our favorite, related to things like cost-cutting mandates. And this can be the kind of change that can be more difficult to manage because of how it personally impacts people. You know, what's going to happen to my job? Will I have to change the way I work? How will I get everything done with fewer resources? But change, as we know, doesn't always have to bring about a negative reaction, and some can be quite positive, but still require a focus on the process and the key success factors to be successful. So today we're going to focus in on some best practices and techniques that will be relevant, hopefully for you, regardless of the scale of change you'll be managing as a leader in the months ahead. But as promised, we will not be true to our word if we did not conduct our very first poll question. Would love to hear from everyone here today. When you're leading change as a change leader, what is your single greatest challenge? If you can identify one of these items that really is one of your most challenging tasks to get through. Is it getting buy-in and support from key stakeholders, getting them to follow your vision? Is it change fatigue, or just perhaps general resistance to change? You know, change is constant. We've seen enough. You know, what is that situation? Or perhaps it's shifting strategic priorities during a project. Maybe there's a change in leadership. Maybe the direction of travel has changed. Sometimes it's just, look, there's too many projects happening, and right now it's hard to find the time and resources to maintain momentum. Or maybe it's not having sufficient resources at the outset, or even overcommitting to the scope of change, you know, or sometimes even confusion around roles and responsibilities and who's going to be responsible for what throughout the program. If there are other items that we did not capture on this poll, please jump into the chat with your comments. Would love to hear from you. How are we doing, Eve, on the responses? I think we're
Really
rolling up.
good.
See a
So
few
yes,
more.
lots of people getting involved. We'd love to get as many as possible. Obviously, this information is going to be interesting as well from a benchmarking perspective to see how other people are feeling about the topic. So we're at 60, just over 60% of, and I see more votes coming in. So we'll just do a little countdown. Let's go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. On this one, just about to hit 70%, which is excellent. We're going to end the poll and share the results with you all.
That's great. Thank you so much, Neve. This is almost an identical replica of responses from our first session that we did earlier today, and can see that change fatigue and general resistance certainly is a challenge. And I think, did we have some comments in the chat as well? All of the above, yes. I contemplated whether to put that as an option, understand as well, definitely. The other comment was, when there are no clear processes, leading change becomes more difficult. Absolutely, great comment. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing and for responding to the poll. We're going to come back to some of these challenges in a moment. But first of all, for those who might be staring change in the face, I have some terrible news for you. Don't mean to start off on a negative note, but the reality is a lot of change programs aren't successful. And again, may not necessarily be the vision that we had originally intended for it. And we've probably all experienced some kind of failed program in the course of our career, regardless of what that was, right? Maybe it was even a recent technology deployment. In a 2022 in-house survey by Onnit, 77% of those surveyed experienced a failed legal tech project, and it left such a bad taste in their mouth, or such a bad taste, that 27% felt that they might want to leave their job. So the challenge with change is that when we're not successful, it can make future change programs obviously that much more difficult to implement. But Andy, do you want to jump in on some of the resistance, some of the reasons why programs fail?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see on the slide there's sort of six key points here as to, you know, why some programs may fail. But if you flip these, they're also the reasons why your program could succeed. But ultimately, it comes down to starting the change with the right foundations, which, you know, often involve choosing the right people to run it with the right expertise, considering, you know, the right amount of investment. And also thinking about the wider landscape. What are the external factors that could actually impact your program, your project? One example that I've got, which you know, is a real good example of stakeholder buy-in and change fatigue, actually, in terms of the poll responses. We heard about a client whose program that they were running internally was around instructing admin resource. They'd brought in a system for doing that, and they were able to basically delegate legal work to sort of paralegal resources and admin resources that they had within the team. This was all done and structured, and it was very successful. They were able to start delegating work. They were able to track the work, which was really important. But then some of the teams changed structure. Some of the scope expanded, and more people needed to instruct through this new system. So they weren't able to accommodate with the additional licenses because they hadn't really thought about how this could scale, which effectively meant incorporating additional scope in a manual way, which effectively meant the admin team having to instruct themselves manually through the system as a workaround. As you can imagine, the business case fell down very quickly, and it became actually a massive burden, and it burnt quite a few people. So they had to roll back a lot of the changes and go back to the slightly older way of working, which obviously meant that there were, you know, time wasting elements. There was additional cost to correct it all, and ultimately, you know, we could consider that an unsuccessful change. A lot of stakeholder buy-in was lost, and the key lesson there being, you know, there's a lot of thought required. You need to look at wider potential impacts, you know, that could come down the line, and really make your program resilient. So yeah, that's just one I wanted to call out.
I think you made an excellent point, Andy, around choosing the right leader for change. And I think that is an essential aspect. And we sometimes maybe don't give enough thought to this. And as this is the title of the program, we want to dive into this straight away in terms of what makes an effective change leader. And I think it's important to think about this as a blend of being able to think and plan strategically and execute on some of the mechanics or the operational aspect of it, while also being able to leverage the power of connecting with people, of that sense of empathy, of having that ability to get people to influence others to follow your lead, right? Atul, now we've mentioned in your introduction, you preluded in your role of executive chairman at Dentons Legal, you've led your firm through some incredibly transformational change at an organizational level. You've mentioned a number of things in our session earlier today around how this could be helpful as a leader and sort of the skills that you employed. Did you want to talk a little bit about that experience for us?
Yeah, so Joanne, just imagine this. On a Friday in 2023, we leave our offices as Link Legal. And on Monday, we come back as Dentons Link Legal. So that's the span in which this whole change was to be implemented. Over the weekend, we changed everything from the information technology platform to stationery. We configured 250 plus new laptops compliant with Dentons security infrastructure, moved to new offices, firewall and routers across offices in 5 cities, launched a new website, changed physical and virtual branding across 5 offices, moved to new matter opening processes and conflict and anti-money laundering systems, new financial reporting systems, including financial resilience protocol. So this is what we had to do over a weekend. Obviously, it was a big change, and we need to take such steps that, it's not only a question of people accepting and assimilating it, but identifying themselves with the change. Now, see, 4 or 5 things which I believe really worked well was that we acknowledged the fact that it is a change and different stakeholders will take time to assimilate, let alone implement the change. We communicated the value proposition from all perspectives. We were very transparent. The communication process was extremely transparent. We really identified the people value proposition in improving their lives as an outcome of the change. And of course, making it very clear to them that this is something which will expose them to the best international practices, because this was the first Indian law firm combining with an international firm of that size. Once we had identified these areas, we wanted to go to the hearts along with their minds. So what we did was we made sure that we value their, their acceptance of the change. So when they came on Monday, there was a new mug welcoming them. There was a welcoming kit. There was a chocolate. There was a flower. And they really felt that this is a change which is going to change their lives. So train. Then, of course, we got on to training. So training and retraining was something which just went alongside. And it was a process which really made them understand the value of the change, plus how to adapt to the change. We also had a third-party validation program, because obviously there is a change which is happening within the organization. There are stakeholders who are going to be impacted by the change. They obviously need a third-party validation, because the leadership's word is not good enough only to give them the comfort that this is going to change their lives. So we had to have a third-party validation program, and it included people of very, very well-respected people within the community of lawyers, and including retired judges. So we really got them on board and got them involved in this whole process, which gave a huge amount of comfort to all our colleagues. So these are only some of the things which we did. And of course, I am more a lawyer than a management consultant or a management expert. But we did this, and believe me, it had a great impact. It was so smooth and seamless that we are ourselves surprised.
That's incredible. Thank you, Atul. I really appreciate the 2 points there that you've made. One, it's little things that count. The little details of the welcome kit, I think, is a great way of making people feel that they're part of the change rather than having it happen to them. And also, just to pick up your point around, sometimes it can be helpful to have that outside party, that additional voice, lending credibility, which I think is an essential skill set of anyone leading change. So, sometimes if you need to lend a helping hand to that voice, but being able to be seen as that authority to dislodge any potential skepticism or cynicism, I think is helpful. But I think it's also the relationships, right? The social capital that you have to build followership, to have that influence. And I think having that empathy and being able to listen, actively listening to concerns, to hearing those voices of others is an essential way to build that trust and to have that level of influence. I also think that the effective change leaders need to have the ability to be empowered to make decisions. I think this is crucial and sometimes overlooked. I've seen projects drag because the person leading the project needed to secure total buy-in from everyone on the team. And that just ended up grinding decisions to a halt. So I think that's an essential point as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about purpose and vision, but this is, I think, one of the most critical jobs of a change leader. And there's lots of different, recognized authorities on the subject. John Kotter is one that I happen to reference here. Harvard professor, international bestselling author. He's designed an 8-step model that can be applied to change management. Maybe you've heard of it. One of the crucial steps that he's identified is the sense of urgency, to be able to answer the question, why are we changing? And he talks about the difference between activity, which can be viewed as frenetic noise, versus actual urgency. So defining what that urgency is. According to his book, he talks about how this is established through the heart and through the minds. And Atul, you mentioned this earlier on as well. You wanted to connect with people on both levels. I think, there's a number of different ways to do that, and I encourage you to dive in to that resource. But there are a couple of points that I think resonated with me, and one of which is to make sure to root out any complacency or negative views. Those individuals that might disrupt the project, find a strategy that's going to work to get them to move in your direction or to move on, and also to leverage that reason for change, the risks of not changing or the benefits of changing. I also think, practically speaking, the ability for someone to be able to break up log jams to not contribute to delays. I think one of the challenges we see in a lot of change programs is that they take longer than we expect. And sometimes those delays can start to create a bit of the resistors or the people who are trying to poke holes in the project. So someone who can, get through decisions, who can break up log jams, who can keep people motivated, because projects can take longer, as I said. And sometimes, being able to keep people focused on that vision is essential. But Andy, talk a little bit about how important it is to be invested in yourself in the project.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fundamental one. I think people can tell if you're not sincere about something, or it's not as genuine. And I think if you're a leader and you're leading a change, you kind of need to believe in it. And that's not always easy, because many of us think of change as sometimes positive. It could be bringing in something that's going to revolutionize how we do things. But then on the flip side, you could be a GC or director or somebody in a position of having to reduce your headcount, and you have to try and figure out a way to get your department working in tip-top shape with less of you but the same amount of work. And how do you get comfortable with that? How do you believe that's the right thing for your team to do to survive and support the business? And sometimes it's not going to be the easiest thing to get invested in. So you need to at least take it as a learning or a growth opportunity, and at least believe in that, and find some way to motivate yourself through the change. And that should then translate to others.
Thank you, Andy. That's great. So we're going to talk a little bit now about the critical success factors for leading and managing change. And there are a number of different principles and models that you might call upon. I mentioned John Kotter, there's the ADKAR model, there's lots of different programs that you can look to. But what we've done here today is curated what we believe to be the critical success factors to help you manage your team through change. And what we're going to do is step through each of these 5 success factors, give some examples of where we've seen this work in the real life. And then we're going to jump to a scenario where we can put this into practice. But one way I think this to me, aside from communication, which I talk about a lot in this context, I think, personally speaking, this is one way where I think change programs can end up not achieving the result that they wanted to achieve in the first place, was because we didn't actually take the time to define the problem that needed to be solved. And sometimes we have a tendency to go immediately to the solution, or a solution is presented to us and it looks really great, so let's jump with that. That's going to be a great project for us to dive into. But Andy, do you want to take us through a little bit more about this importance of defining the problem?
Yeah, so I mean, in some cases, you've got many different things that you're trying to achieve, and it's very easy to jump to solutions as soon as you start to think of the beginnings of the problem. But actually delving into what is the underlying problem that you're trying to solve, or even if you flip that, what opportunity are you trying to unlock, if it's like a growth opportunity. I reflected on this, and in my view, I think there are really a few core handful of main reasons why we need change. Often it's to reduce cost or risk. or it's to increase efficiency, it's to increase quality of what you're doing, or it's to in fact grow or scale. Those are sort of some fundamental reasons why we might need change. And then obviously in an actual business context, there'll be lots of specific things you can associate those to. One sort of really quick example I'll go through is there was one in-house team that we were working with who separately were looking to bring in a really complicated bells and whistles tool to help them with their billing management. And you know, this is often a thing. You will often see lots of really whizzy companies come around and they'll have these really cool tech solutions or, you know, other things. And you think, oh, this will solve my problem and this will be great. What they really needed was, you know, a diligent person or a diligent process to be able to track and manage what was quite a basic problem. And, you know, we actually reviewed their business case with them. And to be completely honest, they had internal tools that would do the job just as well, if not better. And with the money they were going to spend on this very fancy system, they actually had more than enough scope to hire a full-time paralegal or admin person and have cash to spare to run this process. So it didn't actually warrant the sort of the solution that they were jumping to. Exploring that problem properly and really understanding what are we actually looking to get to. We just need a bit of structure. That's the problem we're trying to solve, because at the moment we're all wasting time on something that's not very high value. You can then look at what is actually the effort and cost needed to solve that problem, which really nicely goes onto this next slide, the priorities matrix. You know, how do you sort of quantify, you know, how much effort you need to put into something for the benefit you're going to get out of it? What is your return on investment, if you will? This is a really useful tool to help you understand that. So obviously on one axis, we have the benefit, the impact of an initiative, you know, what you might get out of it. And on the other axis, we've got the effort or the cost. It's always really useful as an exercise, because I'm sure you'll have many competing problems or initiatives that you actually need to weigh up to understand which ones you actually proceed with. You can actually plot all of them onto this matrix and see how they stack up against each other. Typically, you want to focus on the top two quadrants. The top left quadrant is where your quick wins lie. So these are, you know, you get a high benefit for a relatively low cost. So it makes sense to just crack on and get those done. Alongside this, you obviously have the top right quadrant, which is high benefit and high cost. These are typically much bigger change programs with higher risk or complexity, but they often offer a higher return on, you know, whatever your investment is. It will be for you to weigh up the resource and the budget that you have to be able to decide which of these you can tackle in which order, but it should give you a really quick picture as to the ones that are worth going after. On the flip side, if you look at the bottom two quadrants, the sort of pink color you've got in the bottom right, these are probably the things you're going to want to abandon, because they're, you know, they're very low benefit for quite a lot of effort or cost. So they probably don't make a lot of sense. And in the example I gave just now on the bells and whistles billing tool, that would have fallen into this category. That wouldn't have been a great initiative to run with, because it just wouldn't have given the benefit for the cost that was going into it. And then the gray quadrant on the bottom right, on the bottom left, sorry. If you have time and you've done all the other stuff, maybe think about this one. But again, it's probably going to be lower on your priority list.
I think it's a great reflection point, Andy, to take the time to do this, and maybe you do it as a small group of team members, you know, to have this robust conversation and really analyze it. So I think that we mentioned earlier on the case for change and developing your vision, and this is probably, I mean, those are all crucial. I keep saying each one is so critically important, but this one should not be rushed. And this becomes the vision that is going to ultimately become your central focus for your change efforts. And you'll refer to this quite often as part of your key messages. So, you know, it enables you to stay aligned with your goal while at the same time keeping people motivated and focus on achieving that outcome. I like to think of this similar to creating a business case as you would. So as you create the case for change, you'll want to look at your current state, What is the specifics around that problem statement, as well as any data that can help to define the situation. You'll then take that information and start to define your vision, or what does the future state look like, and describe why you ultimately want to embark on the change. I think it's helpful to also think about, listing the drivers for change. What are those? Is it external factors that are driving you to change? Or is it internal priorities? Maybe, to use the technology reference, maybe there's a corporate-wide digital transformation. And so, thinking through how the legal department connects to those organizational priorities is always a great way to demonstrate your value. Also thinking about detailing the risks of inaction, or the consequences if you fail to change, right? This becomes sort of that urgency point. I think the other thing to think about is using stories as a way to enable your key audience or your key stakeholders as a way to relate more concretely to your vision. So as an example, instead of kicking off a workshop where you're going to launch a new project, and kicking that off with a checklist of the reasons why we're going to change, think about telling a story about a negative situation that could have been avoided had you already completed this change. How would that outcome be different if we were successful? The other thing I like to think about too is, and we've done this before internally, is to think about creating a press release, a fictitious press release. What would the vision look like? If you're, as a law department, maybe you're writing your Law Department of the Year award submission. What have you achieved? Who was involved? What benefits are you seeing because of this project? This becomes that vision, a really compelling way to get that across to people. But important to just keep in mind not to rush this phase. It's important to get this message clear. So thinking about stakeholders, understanding who within your department or your organization or even externally will be impacted by the change. And it's important to take the time to understand the needs and concerns of each of your stakeholder groups and identify what will you need to do in order to gain their support for the project. So it's helpful to just, write a checklist, keep a chart listing various stakeholder groups or individuals and understand their needs. What is changing for them? What are their possible resistance points? How will they benefit? And ultimately, what do they need to know? What is that objective? Are you trying to simply achieve buy-in and support from the stakeholder group, or do you need to use this group to conduct in-depth interviews to understand workflows? Or maybe this is an important group of informal influencers that you can help use to leverage to get across your messages and to help support the project. So map this out as an important part of your stakeholder engagement and communication strategy. But Atul, I'll just get you to jump in here around how you can use this step as an important way to build trust and understanding with our stakeholders.
Joanne, I feel the key, of course, we need to first identify the key stakeholders. And the answer to a lot of obstructions that you can face on the way could be really involving them at different levels. I understand it's not an easy job to involve everybody in a large organization, but inclusion in the whole process is very important. For example, we had these young lawyers when we had this transition, whether it's IT, whether it was BD, whether it was HR, governance. Of course, governance is a firm level activity. So we don't have any involvement of younger stakeholders, but a large number of younger stakeholders were involved in other implementation processes and creating those sub-teams who have responsibility. Because then what it also does is creates a peer pressure, which really helps in bringing around the people who are not buying into the change at the first blush. So it's the collective value that comes into the whole process, which really pushes everybody to work towards the same goal. So in one word, it could be collaboration during the implementation process.
I think you made an excellent point around the peer pressure. We're going to dive into that in a second, because I think that's a great way to deal with those individuals who may not want to change. So as you're thinking about those key stakeholder groups, either who's going to be impacted by the change, either directly or indirectly, it's important to think about what is the level of influence or control that they have in terms of the project, and thinking about this in the context of your communication strategy, right? So, for example, if you have individuals who have a high degree of power over outcomes or control over outcomes and are directly impacted, they will need to be managed very closely, in terms of your communications. Maybe that means involving them in more formal roles in the program, getting their support. So that's in the upper right box, number 1, making sure that they're bought in is essential. And thinking about those individuals, perhaps on the bottom left quadrant, number 3, you might be thinking, well, they're not deeply impacted and they're not influential, so maybe we'll just let that group of stakeholders be. I would suggest thinking about, including them in communication, whether that's newsletters that you're running, or maybe that's town halls or other group sessions to keep them informed, because that group can easily become a set of resistors to your program if they're not kept informed. So just keeping mindful of that. Also helpful to think through around who is going to be a supporter and who may be a resistor. And if you've identified resistors in any of these quadrants, what is your approach for that? And so, Atul, you sort of maybe alluded to one point around peer pressure, but what is your experience, and how do you handle resistors who essentially those individuals who just don't want to accept the change? And they will be there, no question.
Yes, they will always be there, but then you've got to work with them. You've got to work with them. And the fundamental premise here is that we should not come to, it's more psychological than physical. And it has to be, you need to identify they're also a part of the group. So we need to work on them, bring them around through different discussions and different levels, and really explaining the value to them. Of course, there would be some set of resistors who will not mend their ways. So you need to get them out of the system, but in a gradual process. But let's accept the fact that they have some good reasons for resisting. We need to deal with those reasons rather than just branding them as resistors and creating an environment of mistrust. We really need to accept the fact that there will be an element and there will be some good reasons. We need to deal with those reasons.
That's an excellent point. And that's just to point out the lower right box, number 4, those individuals perhaps who might be resistors in box number 4, who are deeply impacted and not influential. Those are the individuals you'll definitely want to meet with and understand in advance of your project what barriers to change might exist so that you can get ahead of that. So I think, thinking through the resistors piece is really critical. It's all critical. So poll question, I guess we're poll question number 2. Would love to hear your thoughts as we move to talk a little bit about communications, something I'm quite passionate about. But in terms of your organization or your law department, how effectively do you believe that you communicate as a team or as an organization during times of change? Do you feel that, yes, you're communicating frequently and transparency? Or maybe it depends on the project, it depends on the scale, perhaps, of the project that you're looking at. Or maybe, no, we could do, maybe a better job of communicating, which is absolutely fair as well. Lots of great responses coming in, I see, Neve.
There definitely is. Also, Joanne, there was an excellent tip in the chat from Stefano, just in case anyone has missed it. And it's a great book that Stefano suggests everyone reading. So it's How Big Things Get Done. And it has a really clever and important concept called the Think Slow, Act Fast approach, which Stefano said really obviously fit in with some of the discussion themes today. So the chat's been busy, so I just wanted to point that out if anyone missed it. Yes, we have lots of people getting involved in this one, so I'm going to in the poll and share the results with you all now.
Thank you for sharing the book. That sounds great. We'll have to dive into that. So this is I think when I saw this poll question responses earlier today, I was quite surprised. I think that the poll results are very similar today. That the frequency and transparency of communication is not always there. So It may depend on the project. So I think there's room for growth. Let's all acknowledge in this space. And I think one of the things about communicating during change is that it can be often one of the most overlooked steps. And I think sort of the line at the top of the screen there, communicate with purpose, not by chance. So don't leave it to, well, we'll get to it or we'll think about it. I think, it's in reality, as a change leader, you've had far much more time to process this. You've come up with the idea, you've gone through the business case, you've developed the vision, you're getting people involved. Those people who might be hearing about it for the first time are just that. They're just hearing about it for the first time. So, think about the fact that there's going to need to be time to process the change. There's going to be obviously, your general and broad communications to those impacted, but as you reflect on those key stakeholder groups again, or those individuals again, think through again what objective you want to accomplish for each group or each individual. Think through what are those key messages that you need to land with those individuals. What are the critical communications points throughout the process, throughout the project? It's not, communications at the beginning and then at the end. You'll want to make sure you are consistently updating and informing along the way of any changes or any progress. Think about the mix of tactics and channels, the way in which you deliver the message. Sometimes we think about email as being an important tool. I think we need to think about the volume of email that we receive. And sometimes communicating face-to-face is much more effective, maybe not as efficient. So in that case, maybe you might need to be thinking about having workshops with key stakeholders, again, allowing for that two-way communication, not just a one-way communication, so that you can take the information you receive to further refine and expand and build upon your project. I think the thing about communicating is transparency is essential. If things aren't going to plan, sometimes the lack of communication can start to bring doubt into the project and give those resistors something to pull at. And the other thing I just wanted to share is the being aware of the curse of knowledge. It's the cognitive bias around having the technical information. So you have the background for the project in your mind. You understand why we're doing this. You understand the need for it. Those who are going through the change may not have that same information. And so you're going to want to make sure the way in which you communicate is simple and straightforward, delivers the message, and stays on point as well. We've got a number of resources for you. If you're not yet familiar with our CenterX Resource Hub, Niamh will drop the link into the chat. We have checklists and guides, including this communications plan template, which you can use. And I get, it feels like an extra step. You're like, that's great, Joanne. That's a lot of work on top of my day-to-day, plus leading a change program. I think the thing about, obviously we know what gets documented gets done. So I think that just taking the time to map out your strategy for communicating with stakeholders will make sure that it's not left to chance. So Andy, if you don't mind just dropping us through how to keep the momentum going before we dive into some strategies around in practice.
Yeah, of course. So, we can see on the screen some key points, which I'll quickly go through. Yeah, I mean, the first point about, making special allowances, I do think that's a really important one. Change, has to be enforced and reinforced, and it's something that, kind of needs everyone to take part and sort of follow. So if you do start to make special allowances for lots of different people, sort of accommodating different things, often there are times where that might be really important to consider, but you need to see if it might have a destabilizing effect on your change. It's something to plan for. Obviously, champions are so critical. You need to really, people, there are certain peers across different groups of teams that people will look to. And if they are following the right behaviors, that has a much bigger impact than somebody just talking at them. Really looking at what's going right. Often everyone's very quick to sort of shoot something down, especially when it comes to change, but, really celebrating those success stories and making sure behaviors are acknowledged and rewarded when they're all, going right, is really important. But the final one's the one that probably resonates with me the most, which is regularly reflect, revisit, and improve as needed. Change doesn't stop when you go live with the program. You need continuous touch points, refreshes, reinforcement messages. We all have very short memories, teams have attrition, so it's really important to keep finding mechanisms to keep the change sustained. One of these will be, how are you measuring success? Are you getting a return on your investment? If not, why not? Is the change working as expected? Have you got KPIs or SLAs around this to measure it? And do you have mechanisms for feedback so that you can tweak things? I think we can probably all acknowledge it's very rare to get things right first time. So when you do go live with a big change, in some cases, you'll probably need to monitor it and make some tweaks, see how it's actually working in the real world, and more importantly, seeing how it's being affected by changes around it. You might have leadership changes, or, as we all experienced a few years ago, there was a pandemic. All of these big changes that have complete impact on what we're doing in our own particular teams mean that we have to pivot on the projects that we're working on. And often in a change setting, it's really important to review and tweak.
Thank you, Andy. I just want to call out a comment in the chat around the communication piece and sometimes oversharing results and muting the conversation. I think that's a really excellent point in terms of how we're communicating with others. We have information overload. So I think just to pick up on that point, I think to not miss the opportunities as they present themselves to communicate that might not be in a formal way, right? That might be bumping into somebody in the elevator, or, the 5 minutes before your meeting starts. Finding informal opportunities, I think, are, also a great way to leverage that. So now we're off to the most exciting part of the conversation. We have a poll question for you. We would love to dive into one of 3 scenarios around how can you practically apply some of the principles that we've just talked about, some of the success factors. So you get to decide where we go next. And never fear, not to fear. We have a very robust article on our website, which Niamh, I think, just shared the link, or will be sharing the link, which steps through each of these 3 scenarios in more detail. But tell us where we should go next in the remaining few minutes. All right. Love to give the power of control to the audience. Where will this take us? I think, Andy, just to give you a heads up, you're on point again, as you were earlier today. So looking forward, I think, unless we have any sort of dramatic changes in the results. All right, we have about 60% participated. Niamh, should we get on?
I think so. It's time for any last minute changes of direction, but I don't think we're going to get that. So, there's a little bit of a surge towards the end. So we're heading towards 70, a little bit controversially this time. So yes, we do have a result. So let's end the poll and share the results with you all. And yes, Andy's going to be busy again.
Excellent. Optimizing, balancing workloads across the team. So clearly a priority for many of you as you're looking to combat or to deal with the more for less dynamic. Andy, why don't you walk us through the top 5 considerations to make while balancing and optimizing resources?
Absolutely. So yeah, we've got these 5 points on the slide. What I was going to do is just link them to sort of a lived experience. So as I mentioned, one of the sort of things I do day to day is help set up outsourcing models. And obviously, one of the big popular ones that you'll see out there are for commercial contracts. I'm sure many people on this call deal with that very regularly. Things will cross your desk that maybe you shouldn't be working on because you've got lots of other priorities. So in this specific example, it was how in-house legal departments find ways to be able to focus on strategic work, strategic business partnering, and free up their day-to-day and find ways to actually get their workloads either outsourced to an external provider or actually outsourced to other departments within the business. When we talk about outsourcing, it doesn't necessarily have to be completely out of the business. It could be to another team. So that was really the reason for change in this scenario. It's how do we enable the sort of senior lawyers in an in-house team to become more free and strategically partner with the business? Because at the moment they were taking lots of time up on things that weren't, super value add for their role in the business. So be wary of resistors to change outside of your legal function. So one of the big points here that we see across many teams actually who do this with sort of commercial contracts is if you look at the stuff that in-house legal teams tend to deal with, there are lots of low risk agreements. Let's take the easy one, NDAs. I'm sure many people have found they've been spending far too many hours serving those to the business. This is a really prime candidate for actually giving to another department, creating an automated template or giving other people responsibility to create these with obviously some legal supervision. But in this specific scenario, one of the big resistors for change could be one of the big departments. Let's take procurement, for example, where it would be a huge sort of activity for them to pick up in their view. While we all know that it's probably something that somebody could just take off the shelf, tweak a little bit and send out, it's actually a huge challenge because one, it pushed work onto another team, which they weren't necessarily expecting. And two, in one of these examples, a specific team I can think of, there was a typically high turnover of staff in that particular team. So knowledge was lost frequently. And these were all factors that we had to consider and build into the program. How were we able to convince those teams to actually feel empowered to do this? And how could we sell to them that this was actually a benefit for their teams because they would have less of a bottleneck in legal and it would actually enable them to have more conversations on their side? So that was a big sort of activity we had to do with those specific resistors. On managing internal client expectations, we had to be very open that outsourcing doesn't always equal restructuring. That was a big concern for some of these programs. We've done this with multiple teams. But obviously there's a particular fear that, legal departments may have that if you're sharing work out, it means that your team will shrink. In some cases, that may be the case, but in many of these cases, it's actually about enabling your legal department to be used in the way that it was probably originally intended, which is to really protect and help the business grow. So we really had to do a lot to ensure that internal client expectations were managed so that everyone felt supported. Crisp comms plan, fundamental, a lot of conversations have been had on this in the session today with Joanne and Atul. That we had to create multiple forums for our stakeholders. There would be weekly check-ins for the people involved in the actual program, and that would include outside teams alongside legal, depending on what involvement they had. We also post the launch of this, we had to run many training sessions, drop-in sessions. All of these had to be factored into the comms plan, and they all contributed to successful delivery. So if you get that right, the change will embed a lot more easily. And then finally, as we had a whole slide on this, sustaining the change. To this day, with many of the teams that we've done this with, it's really about having those feedback forums, whether that is monthly, quarterly, annually, to make sure that we can keep this thing evolving in a way that actually still supports the original business case or the case as it changes and evolves over time. Is it still working? Are we updating the processes that we're running with so that they're still effective? How do we continue to support and run training so that people don't forget all the good structures that we put in place? All of that has been critical to sustaining change. It doesn't just end when you go live. Those are probably the big points that come to mind.
Thank you, Andy. I think this is a great scenario to walk through because it is one of those types of programs that deeply impacts individuals. Anytime you look at somebody's roles and the work that they do, and I think that requires that definitely one-to-one, high-touch sort of communication. Niamh, I know the chat is very busy, so you'll hopefully keep an eye and shout out if there's any questions. But before we move on to the Q&A and final poll question, Atul, was there any other final comments you wanted to share before we move on?
No, I think, Joanne, we have pretty much covered the most relevant areas. I would only reiterate that I think communication is a very significant part of this process, and how do we go into the hearts and minds of people. That is a strategy which has a very big impact on how successful the implementation process is. I mean, I would only, of course, we have talked about different things, but I think communication and engagement, these are the two things which would ultimately hold the key to an outstanding outcome.
And it's interesting because a lot of the comments that I've been reading in the chat briefly as I try to balance my screens is, around just the volume of information we receive on a day-to-day basis. And so thinking through how do you break through that noise to capture those hearts and minds, I think is essential as well. Before we jump to a Q&A, welcome. If you want to pop a question in the chat, please do. But as we think through as this is the last of the series, this is the last program of the series, would love to hear from you in terms of, what are your greatest challenges for the year ahead, so that as we reflect on our content for our next program kicking off in the fall, would love to hear from you where we might want to focus that. Of course, lots of different options on the screen. If you could pick 3, or I'm sure you might want to pick them all, as I think was one of the comments earlier on in the program. But identify 2 or 3 of your greatest challenges would be fantastic, so we can tailor our program to you. Whether that means, a focus on, tools to help you with the increasing complexity and volume of work due to changing regulatory requirements or risk, or if it's lack of budget and resources, or helping to demonstrate your value to the business. Or even maybe, looking at those operational efficiencies, which I think certainly is relevant to so many people today as that work keeps increasing, but sometimes the resources do not. So love to see a few more responses if we don't mind. Niamh, how are we doing on the polls?
Good, yeah. So as Joanne said, really your input on how we shape the next series of our client experience program is really crucial. So if you'd like more time, if you'd like to drop us a note, don't wait. Do that. If you have something else that's not on the list, you can use the email address just on the chat at cxprogram@dentons.com. We'd love to get your feedback on today, but also on as we move into a new series from September onwards. We are over 70% in terms of what people would like to see. So this is useful information for benchmarking for everyone to see what's on the top of priority lists. So I am going to end the poll and share the results with you all. So quite a mix. Joanne and the team, I'm sure you're...
Quite a mix.
Yes. Yeah.
I think the increasing complexity, there's some themes here, right? Lack of budget and resources, operational efficiencies, that definitely makes sense. So thank you very, very much for sharing your input today. I appreciate that. And for commenting in the chat. I was just trying to keep an eye on that to make sure we're addressing any questions. Appreciate that. But I think, Niamh, we're almost at time, and so I'll leave it to you to close us out. But thank you to Atul and Andy very much for joining me today on the program.
So whether it's your first session joining us today or you've been with us since the start of the program, we just want to say a huge thank you for your time, your engagement, your input, which really makes these sessions for everyone. As we said, we're thinking about the next series, so please do drop us a note with your thoughts on what you'd like to see. That's really crucial, and of course with your feedback on today's session. There are lots of resources in the meantime available on Centrex. We've shared the link today. Laura, thank you. I think it is slow for loading for some people, but if you retry that link later, and of course get in contact if there's any issues with that. And then finally, I just want to say a huge thank you to our team today for the time, thought and consideration they put into this session. I suppose have really enjoyed the planning and the thinking around this, so we hope you've got value from it today. We're looking forward to seeing you back with us in our next series, but of course we will be in contact along the way before then, continuing to get your input. So thank you for joining us and have a great rest of day.